first name, we are reading from this memory and letting somebody know what first name they have. If we wanted to change it, we will pass the new value over here, and you can see it stores it in this variable, which is the same over here, right? Okay, so anyway, one option is,
So why do we create that public string first name?
were you here in the last lecture or no? Okay. I remember we discussed that if we don't have this part, then if somebody creates one student, tries to access this,
We
they
can
will
directly
be,
make getter and setter.
yeah, these are the getters and setters. The benefit of this is when somebody is calling this, okay, so student S1 equal to new student. So this is how we will create one student, right? Okay, if we don't have that property, then the traditional way will be something like this: set first name, let's say Bill. So this is the traditional way, okay? If we don't have that property, just the get and set, okay? But once we put that property, then somebody can say S1 dot first name equal to Bill. So from a readability point of view, this is a little neater. So it basically says we are modifying the first name. But as I mentioned, as soon as this capital F appears, that it will redirect it either to a get or a set internally. So in this case, which one will it redirect to? The set part. Okay.
Question. Are properties used for any other methods besides get and set?
Our properties used for, they are used to basically expose the fields. So, meaning the private data to the outside world. So we don't use them for functions, we use them simply for data. So again, see from a Java point of view, remember for every, we write getters and setters. So think of a property like a wrapper for both getter and setter to make the calling code look a little bit easier. But internally it is the same as a get and a set.
So my question is there any other examples where you use a different method besides get and set? Any other ways that you can think of to manipulate the data using properties?
If you were doing some poor programming, you can simply declare public string first name, and then you don't need the get and set. Then there's another technique which I will introduce later called indexers, which also will allow you to modify or retrieve the data. Okay. But for right now, since most of you are coming from a Java background, think of it just like a getter and a setter, so nothing special. Okay, so now one way was I declare the private field with a lowercase letter, and then the public field I create as a property. Okay, so as you can see, typing all this code becomes tedious, right? For example, let's go to the second field. String last name. Okay, so how many lines more I need to type to expose it as a property? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines, right? So what if I have 20 fields over here? For every field, I'm writing these 5 extra lines. You can see you'll become tired. Okay. So let me show you a shortcut now. So if you right-click on, after you declare the private field, right-click on it. There's an option called refactor. Then further, if you go to the refactor, further something called encapsulate field. Okay. So if you pick this encapsulate field, okay. Now in the beginning, once you run Visual Studio first time, any change that it will create for you, this checkbox will be checked. Okay. My suggestion is uncheck this checkbox because it speeds up things a little bit. We know it will do a good job, and even if it didn't do a good job, we can manually go and change it. Okay. So take a look over here. I only declared the private field called last name, and once I right-clicked on it, said refactor encapsulate field, it's automatically suggesting me a correct property name, correct? So all I have to do is just simply say OK, and it writes me the 5 lines. Okay. So now our code can go faster. Our code writing. Okay. So typically, once again, as you start creating a new class, identify all the fields. So start only write the private fields. The public property, all you have to do is right-click and encapsulate field. And again, if you made a mistake, you can always highlight, delete it, delete that public property, then right-click again, refactor, encapsulate field, simply click OK. It does add an extra line, which I personally don't like, so I will just delete that extra blank line. Okay? And on purpose, I'll create a tiny bit of a space between the first field and the corresponding property, and the second field and the corresponding property, so that we can clearly see, okay, here's the first field, here's the second field, and so on, right? Now let's pretend a student also has an ID, right? An ID will be a whole number, which is called an integer. So let me pick int ID. Is this the right way to declare a private field, following the convention? No, we said private field start lowercase. Okay. So again, in the beginning, it's okay to make mistakes. Let's say you forgot. You still type capital ID for the private field. It will work. Only thing is, if you went for a job interview or something and they saw you using uppercases for private fields, they think you are a poor programmer, right? So it's like, speaking with poor grammar, okay? So you want to follow the convention. Anyway, even if I pick it capital and if I refactor, and encapsulate field. Okay, so what is the property it is suggesting now?
ID1.
Right, because it cannot say ID again, because that will be like an infinite loop. So now the code will start to become not clean or not as nice. So that's why that's, so again, even if you did that and you realize, oh, that doesn't look good, now the caller will have to say s1.id1, which doesn't make too much sense, right? So again, feel free to, whatever the automatic generated code is, delete it, start again. So int ID. Now if I go right click, refactor, encapsulate field. So now it's correct. I can delete this extra blank line. Okay, so now we have 3 fields: first name and the corresponding public property, last name and the corresponding public property, ID, which is an integer, and the corresponding public property, right? Let me pretend a student takes 2 tests. So int test1. So this is like the midterm test. So right click, refactor, encapsulate field. Okay, and then in test2, right click, refactor, encapsulate field. Okay, so total, how many fields do we have inside of our class? 5 fields. Test2, test1, ID, last name, and first name, correct? Okay, so now let's go and think of adding some functions which are closely related to this data. Okay, those functions are called methods, right? Okay, and functions or methods are declared public usually public, unless there's a special reason to hide them from the outside world. Okay, so we'll start with the public keyword. Okay, remember last time I mentioned the philosophy in C-type languages is first is the name of the data type, followed by name of whatever variable or function. So suppose we wanted to write a function called compute grade, which will take a look at the two test scores and assign a grade of A minus, A, B, whatever, right? So since the return from this function will be A minus A or something like that, right? The data type is string. Okay. Compute grade. Okay, now especially if you're coming from a Java background, you'll have a tendency to write it with lowercase c. Okay. And once again, it will work. It will not complain. But like I said, better to follow the convention. So the convention in C# is the function names start uppercase, right? Okay. So now because this function is being written inside the student class, it has access to all the data, all the private data. Okay. So suppose we wanted to give 40% of the grade to test 1 and 60% of the weight to test 2. Okay? Now you have two options of writing over here. This is perfectly okay to compute the weighted average, or I could also use test 1 with a capital T and test 2 with a capital T. Which option is better?
This one. This one.
Let me give you first answer, both will work, okay? When we write capital T, what will it do? It will redirect it to what? Either the get function or the set function. So which one will it redirect to in this case? Get, because we need the value of the test 1, right? But remember, anytime we call a function, it's extra processing in our computer, okay? Because this compute grade is part of the student class, and inside the box we can directly take a look at the private data. So if we put lowercase t, then it directly accesses the variable rather than having to go through a function, so obviously it's faster, okay? So inside the class, try to access the private variables directly. Outside of a class, you don't have a choice. You'll have to go through the capital T in this example, okay? So anyway, since we are inside the class, okay, let me mention one more thing about C#. Okay, C#, like Java, is completely object-oriented. Okay? So what does that mean? That means all variables and functions have to belong to a class. Okay? There's no such thing as a global variable, unlike C++. Okay? So let me also put a comment over here. Unlike C++. Okay. In C++, you can still create functions that do not belong to a class, or variables can be declared outside a class. Remember, creating global variables is a poor programming. So both Java, C# won't even allow you to begin with. So they have to belong to a class, right? So coming to our example over here. Okay, so let me go over here. So see, this is where I started the class, right? So where did I declare this variable? Is it inside the class or outside?
Inside.
Inside. Now suppose I go outside of this class, above over here, and I say int data. Okay, int data. Okay, do you see right away it gives me a red squiggly line? Okay, so anytime you see this red squigglies, that means you did something wrong. Okay, there's no point in trying to run the program because it's incorrect. Okay, so same way I cannot write a function over here. Any variable, any function we write has to belong to a class. Okay, so now suppose coming over here, let me first remove this for a second. So let me cut this. Okay. Pretty soon, as you keep writing, your code will start to become bigger and bigger, right? So if you have to add one function to the student class, the question is, where do you add it? Do you add it in the beginning? Do you add it somewhere in the middle? Or do you add it at the end? Okay, and the answer is doesn't make a difference. You can put it anywhere you feel like. What is a good practice? A good conventional practice is declare the variables at the top, and after you have declared the variables, then write the functions. Okay, so I need to go down over here and write the function somewhere over here. Okay, can I write it over here?
No, that would be outside the class.
Okay, that will be outside the class. So the question is, how do we know where the class ends? Okay, so let me summarize it by saying the very last curly is what? If I go to it's the end of the namespace. The second last curly, so the second curly is the start of the student. The second last curly is the end of the class. So anything we write should be above the last two curly braces, right? So once again, if the code becomes huge, you can always go to the bottom above the last two curly braces, keep adding. Anyway, so double ABG equal to, so this will give us 40% of the weight to test 1, 60% to test 2. Now we can write an if statement. So if ABG is greater than 90. Okay. Now before we are done, we need to return an A minus, B plus, right? So we need to return a string. So let's declare a string variable. String grade equal to left. It's always a good practice anytime you create a variable to initialize it to something, okay? Two double quotations means the string does not have anything in it, it's blank to begin with. Okay, so if ABG is greater than 90, we will say grade is A. Okay. Else if ABG is greater than 85, let's say we will say grade equal to A minus. Else if ABG is greater than 80, grade equal to, let's say, B plus. Else, okay, to save time, let me say grade equal to B. Of course, you won't be graded like this. Okay. Anyway, just to save time, I won't keep writing else if. You get the idea. At the end, we will say return grade. Okay, so now a slight warning or a comment from programming point of view. For those of you who are new to programming or don't feel too strong with their programming background, okay, in C#, just like Java, every statement is terminated by a semicolon, okay? Now, the if statement actually, so this is the condition. The condition has to be put within parentheses, so those are required, okay? So if you're new to programming and you learn, oh, every statement has to be terminated by a semicolon, you have a tendency to put the semicolon over here, okay? For an if statement, because remember, if requires what action should we do if this was true. So the first semicolon appears after we have put something, right? So not right over here. So that's like terminating it halfway before it's completed. Same way, if you are new to C style of programming, and you learn every statement has to be terminated by a semicolon, you have a tendency, as you declare the function, to put a semicolon right over here. So again, functions do not need a semicolon because it's a continuation. It has a begin curly, end curly, so that's the entire functions. So that's why we don't put semicolons, right?
Question,
Mhm.
a small question. You know in Java how you end the if statement with syntax, opening closing syntax before the else?
In Java also, if it is a single statement you are doing, you don't need begin curly, end curly. So in other words, if I wrote it like this, begin curly, and then end curly, it's perfectly okay. But because I'm only doing one thing, then this is optional. So
Yeah, I just want to know the difference of the difference between this. Is it the synthesis of both? Why would you want curly? Why would you want curly?
because you can type curly if you feel comfortable, but why type 2 extra lines if they are not needed?
So when do you need it?
If there's a single thing you are doing. See, let me, so for example, take a look over here. So if I said if A equal to 5, okay, I wanted to do B equal to B plus 2, C equal to C minus 7, right?
Yeah.
So now I wanted to do both of these things if A is 5. So now the begin curly, end curly is mandatory. You don't have a choice. Otherwise, there will be incorrect code. So these are required. Okay. However, if I only needed, suppose I only needed to do one thing, okay, then it's your choice. You can still put begin curly, end curly. Or, like I said, if it is just one thing you are doing, then in all C-based languages, including C, C++, Java, C#, you don't have to put begin curly, end curly.
Is it because the way the computer is?
That's how the language is defined. It automatically understands because there was a single thing you were doing, so it will just do that one thing. But multiple things you do need begin end. Okay, let me just go 2 more minutes and write a test program. So our first student class is ready. It has 5 fields, right? It has one function, compute grade, which is public. So from the outside, somebody can call it, right? So to test it, this is what I'll do. I'll double click on the form. Once the form appears, there's a toolbox over here. If I go to the toolbox, I'll expand all Windows forms. I'll put a button, double click on a button. Okay, once the button appears over here, you can make it bigger. So you will give 2 properties to this button. Okay. If you click on this alphabetical over here, okay, and then scroll to the top, okay, there's a name property so that our code can recognize it. So typical convention is for a button, we'll give it a 3-letter prefix, BT and lowercase. Let me just call it test, T uppercase. And then whatever we wanted to appear on top of the button, that's the text property. And so let's say we call it test student. It's up to us, whatever we say. We can put spaces over here, that's perfectly okay in the text property. But in the name property, because that's related to the code, no spaces are allowed. Okay? So now if I double click on the button, it will take me to a code area. And a function, so if we click on the button, this function will be automatically triggered. So now let me create one student, student S1 equal to new student. Let me set some fields, S1 dot test1 equal to, let's say, 79, S1 dot test2 equal to, let's say, 88, and message box dot show grade equal to plus S1 dot compute grade. Okay, and so we are ready to test it. So we created one student. We stored test 1 of 79, test 2 of 75. Notice we are outside the class, so we have to go with the capital letter. And then message box dot show will pop up. It will literally say grade equal to, and then it will call the function compute grade, whatever A minus, A B plus it brings back will display over here. So if I run it, remember to run it, debug, start without debugging, and click on the button, and if the grade is B plus. So once again, for those of you who already know programming, this is too basic for you, but for those of you who are new to it, make sure you go home, recreate it, run it, and this is the way you will get better at it, right? So I'll stop at this point.